protecting wildlife for our children's future, including his own 3 grandsons. Live from Alaska, please welcome Larry Schweier.
Somewhere there may be an Earth where the temperature is not getting hotter, where the rainstorms are not getting bigger, where the bigger floods are not wreaking havoc, where deeper and longer droughts are not killing crops, animals, and people. Where the fires are not spreading wildly and burning hotter and longer. Where the winds and storms are not getting more destructive. Somewhere, but not here. Reality is setting throughout the world. Pakistan in 2010 experienced its worst flooding along the 1,240-mile Indus River. Enormous storms damaging homes, destroying property, and causing many lives. Along the river's course, families have been lost, homes have been destroyed, lands carved away. Over 20 million people affected by flooding, further destabilizing a nuclear-armed country. Again, Pakistan, people rescuing their remaining possessions, salvaging what they can, helping to move their cattle to safe places. Australia in 2011, January of this past year, experienced the major flooding along 2 of its great rivers. The Bremer River and the Brisbane River experienced enormous flooding, some of the worst in the history of the country. More significantly, the scientists had been tracking the ocean temperatures prior to this great storm and determined that the oceans were about 1.5 degrees centigrade warmer than they had been from 1970. So Grantham, Australia, again, massive flood, tremendous losses. The Great Australian Flood of 2011 covered an area larger than the entire nation of France and Germany combined. Streets were flooded, homes were destroyed, cars lost, property ruined. Seoul, South Korea, the floods in Seoul were the worst in 100 years of records. They actually reached to the 4th floor in some of the high-rise structures. We also saw tremendous mudslides that affected the entire region. Again, South Korea, Hunan Province, China. The storms were about 50% above normal. Heavy rains inundated 13 provinces in central and southern China. 8.5 million people affected by those storms. Again, Jiangxi and the people of China affected by a massive storm. India also experienced flooding this past year. In August of 2011, actually this past month, they saw enormous erosion of some of their important croplands, and again, tens of thousands of people affected there. Colombia, South America has experienced a number of major storms in recent years. This happens to be 2011. In the last year, rainfall in Colombia was 5 times the historic average. Over 2 million people have been displaced from their homes. Again, Colombia. The Mississippi River experienced at Vicksburg 1 foot above historic levels in the 1927 flood. I think it's important to note that we avoided the reflooding of New Orleans by opening up the floodgates that took about 3 foot of water off the Mississippi River. Memphis, Tennessee, another city that was experiencing enormous floods this year. This happens to be May 8th in Memphis. Again, all the cities up and down the Mississippi and the Missouri, many of the Missouri communities were flooded as well. This happens to be Minot, North Dakota. The largest flood recorded in the history of North Dakota occurred in June of this year. Last year, Nashville, Tennessee experienced a once-in-a-thousand-year flood. It was unprecedented in the amount of area that was flooded. This happens to be a portable classroom. Portable classrooms are intended to be moved, but not like this. We see tremendous loss and destruction in Nashville, Tennessee. Typhoon Meiji is another major storm to strike the Asian coast. This was October 21st in 2010. Typhoon Meiji in Taiwan caused a 45-inch rainfall in a 48-hour period. Over 350,000 people had to be evacuated from that location. Again, another major city flooded in Thailand. Albania also experienced enormous floods. Their river crested at levels that were higher than they had been for 100 years. Again, all in the same time frame. Teresópolis in Brazil experienced not just floods, but also massive landslides. Those landslides destroyed many homes. Over 900 people died during the 2011 Brazilian floods. Nearly all of them were killed when the avalanches of mud and debris smashed on their homes in the early hours of January 12th of this year. This is just one film clip of what happened. This dramatic rescue was captured on film as the building was falling apart. This woman was able to escape, and we can only hope her dog survived as well. Brazil is feeling climate changes that are happening in the world when there is severe drought in areas that are not supposed to have drought, and when it rains too much in places where it hadn't rained. This is from the former president, who nailed very correctly what is happening in that country, and we'll talk more about that. Mexico is another place where we've seen massive flooding in recent days. This happens to be the 19th of September in 2010. But we've seen over and over again these major storms that are happening around the world. And so the question needs to be asked, why are there so many more downpours and floods throughout the world? Why is this happening now? And is there a linkage to climate change? And here we have from one of the top scientists from National Center of Atmospheric Research. Global warming is contributing to an increased incidence of extreme weather because the environment in which all these storms are being formed has changed from human activities. This is from one of the top reinsurance companies in the world, Munich Re, and their point is, and these are the people that actually bet on avoiding climate and other disasters, so they have money in the game. And the only plausible explanation for the rise in weather-related catastrophes is climate change, and that's from Swiss Re. That's their assessment of the current situation. There is no longer something that's theory or conjecture or something that comes from a computer model. We're now seeing climate change happening, and it's real, and it's a scientific fact. And this is from Richard Somerville, another distinguished scientist at the University of California at San Diego. Scientists used to say that we're loading the dice, and that is that we're changing the odds of extreme weather events. Today, they're changing that story a bit and saying that we're painting more dots on the dice. That is, we are not only rolling more 12s, but we're now rolling 13s and 14s. The storms themselves are becoming more intense. In other words, big storms are becoming both more frequent in terms of more common and are also much bigger. And that is again happening as we've seen around the world. Was global warming the cause of the 2010 heat wave in Moscow or the 2003 heat wave in Europe? And I would add here in Alaska, or the 2004 massive forest fires and heat wave that we experienced here in Alaska. All-time record high temperatures have been reached in many Asian nations in 2010 and an incredible Pakistan flood in 2010. And James Hansen, the distinguished scientist, is asking that question. And his answer is very clear. An appropriate answer in that case is almost certainly not. Would these events have occurred if carbon dioxide had not remained at its pre-industrial level? So clearly there is a linkage between what we're currently experiencing and what carbon dioxide is doing to the planet. And here's to look more closely at the linkage between the climate crisis and extreme weather events and the increased frequency and severity of those events. As CO2 increases, so does the temperature. We get this from the climate record that's now able to look back over long periods of time. We see as carbon dioxide increases, so does the temperature. Not hard to understand. As temperature increases, though, the oceans absorb much of that energy. As much as 90% of the climate change energy, the energy that's caused by the increased CO2, is actually ending up in those oceans. And they are giving off more moisture back into the sky. And that's happening in a very dramatic way. If you look at the annual global temperature from 1880 to 2010, you see a strong uptick in global temperatures. And if you look at the increase in precipitation, these are the heavy precipitation days, the days that have extreme events. You can see that they have a pattern that parallels the temperature pattern. And it's not hard, again, to understand that as you evaporate more moisture in the air, more precipitation, we end up with waters returning to the sea in ways that are much more intense than they have in the past. Warmer air can hold a lot more water vapor. With each additional 1 degree centigrade of temperature, the atmosphere's capacity to hold water vapor has increased by 7%. And what we're seeing today is there's a 4% increase in water vapor over the oceans above what there was even 30 years ago. So we're seeing a significant increase in the amount of water vapor. And it doesn't sound like a lot until you understand that some of these storms can sweep up tremendous quantities of moisture over perhaps as much as 2,000 miles. So the rainstorms and snowstorms are getting bigger and more intense, causing bigger and more intense floods. And as the global temperatures continue to increase, the Earth's water cycle intensifies all the more in the years to come, causing bigger, harder downpours and simultaneously causing longer and deeper droughts. And we can go through this in some detail, but evaporation from the ocean increases atmospheric moisture. As the air gets even warmer, it holds even more water vapor. Heavy downpours get even heavier, causing more storms. Snowpack melts sooner because of the warming temperatures. There are no longer intervals of drought-stricken areas between downpours, making droughts even worse. And more water also evaporates more quickly from the soil, making droughts deeper and longer. So there is longer and deeper droughts caused by the same phenomenon that's causing these greater storms. It seems hard for some to understand that, but that's in fact what is happening. The same extra heat that evaporates water from the ocean pulls moisture even more quickly from the soils of our planet. And it's that drying out of landscapes that adds to the drought intensities and also adds to the potential for fires. This particular body of water is the largest water body in China, and it also holds about 500,000 waterfowl under normal conditions, and is a very important water body because it has a number of endangered species attached to it. And so the Paul Young Lakes drying up has significant consequences, particularly for the finless porpoise that holds its remaining population largely in this area. The Hunan province in China, again another very dry place. Here you can see an interesting map of China that shows the extreme droughts that they've experienced. This happens to be June 2nd, 2011. And you notice that while they're having extreme droughts in parts of China, they're also having extreme moisture in other parts of China. And so you have both of these things running parallel, and that's in fact what we saw in the United States this year. Syria, again, this particular farmer had 400 acres of wheat, and now it's all desert. That's a common pattern that we're seeing in other parts of the Middle East. This Manaus, Brazil, I was here 2 years ago. In fact, I was in a boat on this very river, and today, 2 years later, it's now dried out. This is a river that flows out of the incredible jungles of Brazil, and we see the Rio Negro now, drying up and a child actually walking on it. The Amazon itself is in a drying mode at this stage, and that's a very troubling pattern because the Amazon holds an enormous amount of carbon and is a very vital carbon sink for the planet. And as it dries out, it also has the potential of having massive forest fires and having reduced carbon storage, which is, again, a very extraordinarily important part of our carbon balance on the planet. This happens to be at Brasilia National Park. The Russians are experiencing a drying out of their forest as well. The boreal forest in Russia that are in severe drought. In 2004, they lost an area the size of Pennsylvania, about 29 million acres. This past summer, the 2010 summer, was extreme. They had over 900 forest fires burning all at the same time, and experienced some of the worst heat that region experienced in over 500 years of records. They also lost a quarter of their wheat production, and other crops were parched in the fields. Over time, the Russians decided to terminate all their international wheat sales. They also had enormous loss of lives. Moscow, for example, was losing twice the number of people dying every day in Moscow during this event that would normally die in that city. Russia had, again, experienced severe air quality. This happens to show carbon monoxide, but it shows the amount of pollution caused by these burning forests. 4 months later, we saw world food prices spike after the Russians decided to quit selling their wheat because they needed it at home. And you see this upswing in food production, or food costs rather, as a result of the loss of that important wheat supply. The Russian President Medvedev made it clear that he understands the significance of climate change and urged that it should incite all of us as we see the stress on food supplies and elsewhere. At the same time, we're seeing these massive floods across America in various river systems. Phoenix, Arizona experienced 3 massive dust events where the city was engulfed in a dust cloud caused by the severe drought that Arizona has been experiencing. They also burned over 1 million acres in Arizona this year. U.S. drought conditions were severe, particularly in Texas, where almost 2,000 fires burning in Texas burned about 3.5 million acres. 252 of the 254 counties in Texas have experienced wildfires this year. And that's a pattern we're seeing throughout the United States. Scripps Institute, for example, took the data from the U.S. Forest Service over the many years and determined that we're seeing forest fires at a scale that we hadn't seen before. 4 times the number of fires, 6 times the number of acres burnt, and clearly there's a pattern developing. Not all of it's related to climate change, but certainly a significant portion of it is. The most important aspect of that is in the last 3 decades, the wildfire season in the West has extended by 78 days. High temperatures and drought sharply increase the frequency of areas burned. And here you can see a projection of what's going to happen if we continue to add warming to our planet. This is a projected increase of 1 degree centigrade over the next few years. Los Alamos, New Mexico had a massive fire this year. Firefighters narrowly prevented a fire from spreading into the Los Alamos National Laboratory, a very important place. British Columbia had enormous fires, and I may say that the Canadians are losing their boreal forest. They're projecting that 8 of the next 10 years that their boreal forest will actually lose more carbon than they'll store, and so the Canadian boreal forest will become a carbon source and not a sink. And for someone who works for wildlife, seeing this image really reminds me how important it is that we address climate change, because wildlife are clearly in the bullseye of what's happening to our world. And you can see this global drought chart. This happens to be January to June of 2011. 387 million people were affected by the exceptional droughts that occurred this year, and that's the reality of it. We can solve this, and we must, before it gets a lot worse. Here's what scientists are predicting about drought intensification. This happens to be a sequence of images that show this happens to be 2060 to 2069. You can see how the droughts spread in some really important areas on the planet, and something that we simply cannot let happen. This happens to take it to 2100. So again, you see a very dramatic uptick in the amount of drought-stricken landscapes. This particular river drains about 1/5 of France, and it's the largest river in that country. And the Loire River is also described as France's Garden of France. And you can see the Garden of France in 2011 has already experienced some of that drought. And this happens to be Switzerland, again experiencing severe drought. There are those who deny the existence of the climate crisis, often claiming there is no scientific consensus about this. Here's a list of all the national academies of science in every major country in the world who have confirmed the anthropogenic global warming. Clearly, the number of academies that reject the science of climate change are slim. There's none. You also look at the national academies and what they're saying. The need for urgent action to address climate change is now indisputable. And that's a joint statement by, an unprecedented joint statement by the National Academies of Science for the G8 and 5 other major industrial nations. Every major scientific society in the world in the fields related to the study of global warming confirm the consensus that climate change is not only real, but it's caused by humans. 97 to 98% of the climate researchers most actively publishing in the field support the tenets of anthropogenic climate change, and that is from the proceedings of the National Academy of Science. The deniers seem certain that the world's scientists are wrong and that spewing 90 million tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every day is not having an impact. They know that there has to be something else causing this, and they have many theories that are operating out there. And so the question is, whom? What could that be? Well, here's some examples.
When you look at a volcanic eruption, which I've seen scientists reveal that this could be 50,000 times what man's involvement in terms of creating CO2 would be, you begin to scratch your head and wonder, wait a minute, what is this?
What it is a red herring. The definition of red herring is something intended to divert attention from the real cause. Here's the reality of it. What source emits more carbon dioxide, volcanoes or humans? And the data is very clear. Volcanoes put out on average about 0.1 to 0.2 gigatons per year, where human activity puts out 35 gigatons per year. The climate crisis is being caused by human activity, and the oil and coal companies might not be able to dump all their global warming pollution into the sky if people realize what is going on. But wait, those are the same companies that give deniers all the campaign money. And isn't there something else that they can blame it on? Here's Dana Rohrabacher.
It's called sunspots. Yes, solar activity. That explains why one sees similar temperature cycles on Mars and Jupiter to the cycles that are happening on this planet. That's why ice caps on those planets, like on ours, expand and contract. It's the sun, stupid.
Well, I'm not sure about what's happening on Venus or Mars, but the reality is that solar energy is affecting our climate in very simple ways and very subtle ways, but not in a significant way that would in fact cause the temperatures to do that. And in fact, if you overlay solar activity with temperature, you see that there's one does not in a very significant way impact the other. According to this analysis, solar forcing contributed negligible to the long-term warming of the past 25 years. That's from two scientists that looked at this issue. Regarding the possible linkage between solar activity and climate change, one researcher said that that's a coffin with so many nails in it that it's hard to find a place to put another. Some skeptics claim that scientists simply rely on computer models, and that's another red herring. The reality is that there are a number of active fingerprints identifying the cause of increased global warming. There are 12 separate lines of evidence showing significant human-caused warming. I'll only draw your attention to one, and that's the sea level ice extent. The Arctic this week has now registered the lowest ice extent since records have been kept on the Arctic. And that's a very significant one, but there are 12 of them, and each one of them are worth looking at and understanding. The deniers have always tried to rely on their favorite tool, which is ridicule, and they particularly love to say that carbon dioxide is not harmful, you idiots. We have the senior scientist from Fox News, Glenn Beck, telling us about this.
So let me just break it down. Carbon dioxide is basically this. Look how much pollution I just put out.
I suspect more than others, but the truth of the matter is that is not what's driving it.
Is a carcinogen that is harmful to our environment. It's almost comical.
That's another red herring. No one has ever suggested that carbon dioxide is a carcinogen. Carbon dioxide traps a lot of heat, and that's what's causing the problem, and it's primarily from industrial and automotive and other transportation sources. This is another example of the increased temperatures we're seeing on the planet. Around the world, we're seeing all sorts of records being broken with some stunning temperatures that just defy imagination. I mean, I can't even fathom what it would be like to live in a place where it was 127 degrees. And yet we're seeing those kinds of temperatures popping up all over the world. New Delhi, India, for example, 109 degrees. New York City this year in July had experienced a severe heat wave and had many people needing treatment. The number of records that are being broken in the United States in 2011 are just stunning. When you look at the total records that are being fractured, over 200 cities broke or tied their all-time record high temperature. And again, over 6,000 daily high temperature records have been broken or tied in the U.S. this year. And all of the 50 U.S. states have broke or tied a temperature record in July. And the daily records are one thing, but if you look at the nighttime records, they are really an indication in my mind of the climate threat that carbon dioxide creates, because global warming increases nighttime temperature as carbon dioxide traps heat in and doesn't allow it to escape. And you see the nighttime records that were broken this July are just absolutely stunning. Many skeptics also claim that global warming has stopped and the temperatures are not increasing at all. Again, another red herring. The reality is that we see a continued increase in global surface temperatures. Here are 4 separate records from 4 separate credible scientific research facilities, NASA, NOAA, the Hadley Center, and also the Japanese Meteorological Agency, all of them showing this incredible warm-up of our planet, and all of them showing the threats that are before us. And incidentally, 2010 was the hottest year ever measured. I am interested to see what happens as we get to the end of 2011. But all these red herrings are part of a strategy put in place by the carbon polluters. Their cynical objective is to mislead the American and other publics, to tell us that these problems are not real, and to suggest other threats. They want to reposition global warming as theory rather than fact, and they've done it before. The most dramatic example of that was with the cigarettes and the advertising that occurred around cigarette smoking. But clearly we're seeing that today on television and all the radio and other ads that we're hearing. We know we need to change. Our energy policies are out of whack. I won't dwell on that, but having spent 30 days in the Gulf of Mexico, drill baby drill has its consequences. We should learn from other societies who have paid a severe price when they did not change. We have solutions at hand, and that's an important thing. If a 14-year-old boy can produce wind to power his community, and we have wind generation going on all over the world in various places, some very powerful examples. China, for example, produces half of the total wind production in terms of manufacturing, and this particular location is one of those 86 plants that they operate. We can do the same. We're doing it in many parts of the United States. Right here in Alaska, again, we're doing the same kinds of things. We can produce energy without putting carbon in the sky. We know how to do it. It's a matter of making the right choices to accomplish that. We're seeing solar popping up in wonderful places, and much more needs to be done, obviously. But clearly, the technology is in place. The price of solar, incidentally, is coming down very dramatically. And we see an ethical dimension of this as well. The Vatican has seen its moral obligation to make a safer world for the next generation and have put solar on their facilities. We're seeing the same thing happening in China. And here in the United States, we've seen a recent uptick in the amount of solar production and use in the country. We hope that continues. It needs to grow much more aggressively to eliminate the coal plants that were being proposed. We're seeing some being canceled. We need more to be canceled. We need all of them to be canceled. We need to move to a super grid. We need to have clean energy to drive our vehicles, to run our homes, to run our factories, and to move us about from city to city. We also are seeing some wonderful technologies that are occurring in other parts of the world. We need to duplicate that here in the United States and elsewhere. Children are planting trees, helping to store carbon, helping to rebuild the carbon in our soils. There are things that we can do, and you might be asking at this point, what can I do? Well, I would start by winning the conversation that you have with the deniers. Don't let denial go unchallenged. Use social and traditional media outlets to get the word out. Use the hashtag reality and in all your communications. Write to the editors of your local papers and to your communicate with your television and radio stations. Join a Climate Reality Project and other organizations committed to solving the climate crisis. We also recommend, I would urge you to be a part of both National Wildlife and the climate efforts in other organizations. Deepen your commitment. Make consumer choices that reduce your energy use. Consider the environmental impact of every item you buy. Changing the laws is more important than changing your light bulbs. So tell your lawmakers that this matters to you. Give them your clear indication of what you think about need for actions, because the time is now. We have little time to head off what could be a very catastrophic outcome, and we don't want that. I speak as a grandfather. There may be an earth where reality doesn't matter, but not at this moment, not on this planet. We have an obligation to our next generation. This is the one and only Earth that we will ever have, or love, or touch, or tend for our children and for their children. And as a grandfather of three, this second line really is important to me, because I want my grandchildren to inherit a kind of world that they deserve, and not the kind of world that we're about to give them. Working together, we can solve this problem. We must solve this problem. That simple truth is reality. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Larry Schweiger. Stay warm in Alaska. And now let's get to our panel discussion. I'll first introduce our panelists. Please welcome Eugene Cordero, Associate Professor in the Department of Meteorology and Climate Science at San Jose University. Noah Diffenbaugh, Assistant Professor at Stanford University's The Wood Institute for the Environment. Don Wibbles, Professor of Atmospheric Services at the University of Illinois. Simon Donner, Assistant Professor in the Department of Geography at the University of British Columbia. And our Climate Reality founder and chairman, Mr. Al Gore. So let's begin with Noah. Before we talk specifically with Alaska, let's talk a little bit about what's happening worldwide, specifically temperature trends in the last 100 years and 10 years. Can you explain what's going on?
I often get asked if I believe in global warming when people hear that I'm a climate scientist, and my response is always that if you believe in thermometers, then you have to believe in global warming. It's really not a matter of belief, it's a matter of observation. And we know from direct measurements of temperature around the world that Earth's global mean temperature is rising, and that it has been rising since the onset of the Industrial Revolution. And we understand the cause of this warming very well, and the role of human emissions of greenhouse gases in driving that warming. We also know that Earth is a chaotic, complex system, and any complex system has variations. So we know firsthand from our own experience that there are periods of warming and cooling, and as a warming trend occurs, we certainly expect that there will continue to be noise within that series, and we see that over the last 100 years and over the last 10 years.
So Mr. Gore, let's turn to you. What can we say about why the temperature is rising? What's causing it?
Well, there are distinctive fingerprints, as these scientists are more qualified to point out than me, that really pinpoint man-made greenhouse gases as the cause. We're putting about 90 million tons every day of this heat-trapping pollution into the atmosphere. One example of a fingerprint that identifies this cause is something mentioned in an earlier panel. If it was being caused by variations in the sun, energy from the sun coming, you would expect the stratosphere, the highest part of the atmosphere, to warm up also. But if it's caused by the heat-trapping gases, then that's trapping them from the heat from going back out. So you would expect the lower atmosphere to warm up and the stratosphere to actually get cooler. Well, that's exactly what's happening. It's like CSI climate. The smoking gun is right there. But it's only one of many smoking guns. They have many lines of evidence that are all consistent and congruent and all point to exactly the same cause. Even the CO2 has a molecular signature that can be used to trace it back to whether it's combustion of fossil fuels or some other kind of source. So it's really identified, and I mean 97, 98% of these most distinguished climate scientists wouldn't be able to agree on this if they didn't have really authoritative evidence.
Eugene, let's turn to Alaska there. Can you talk about what's happening there?
Well, Alaska is warming at a rate, and the Arctic in general, a much higher rate than what's happening in the mid-latitudes and in the tropics. So we're seeing the temperatures rising faster, and this year we've noticed and determined that at the ice in the polar region, the Arctic ice cap, has reached a level that we hadn't seen until 2007, and a record amount of ice has been melted. And again, that's consistent with the fact that the planet's warming, and then the high latitudes are warming even faster. And Alaska then is, in terms of the United States, is seeing those impacts most dramatically in terms of melting of glaciers, also in terms of ocean temperatures. And you know, there's a big fishing industry, obviously, in Alaska, and as temperatures continue to warm, the fish will change their patterns, and where people can have access to that industry will change. So Alaska certainly is at the forefront of climate change right now.
And now, Don, you've recently returned from Alaska. What were your observations?
Well, my wife and I spent 10 days on a cruise in the Inner Passage, and then traveling by land up to Fairbanks, and seeing many interesting sights along the way. Two things really struck me about the changes in climate and the effects you're seeing in Alaska. The first was the glaciers. It's really obvious when you see how far the glaciers have retreated relative to what they were a century ago, and it's just amazing. The other aspect is that the sea lion population is decimated in much of Alaska, and it's having a big impact on the Native American population, and because they depend on sea lions in part for food. And that in part is probably related to our overfishing, but there's studies now that also indicate that climate change is playing a role in that decrease.
Now, Simon, if the permafrost in Alaska continues to thaw, what are the predictions?
Well, as permafrost thaws, you're effectively going from hard land to soft land, so it's going to have huge effects on all the ecology. It's going to have huge effects on infrastructure. You know, a lot of things are basically going to collapse and sink as a result. But the thing we're really worried about long term is that all of that that soil that was once frozen up in the north, Alaska, the Canadian Arctic, on, stores a lot of carbon. You know, that carbon basically can't decompose into the soil's frozen. So once we melt it, now suddenly all this chemistry can happen that couldn't happen before. And so that carbon can get released to the atmosphere as CO2, but also as methane, and methane is a much more powerful greenhouse gas than CO2. So what we're really worried about long term is a feedback effect, that as the climate warms, we could end up releasing more carbon from the soils in the north and make the climate warm even more.
At an accelerated rate.
Exactly.
Wow. Now, Don, it's not just permafrost, it's also it's ice mass. It's the lowest on record. Can you explain that?
Yes. Well, we've seen a dramatic decrease in the amount of ice in the Arctic over the last 30, 40 years. And the lowest year was 2007. 2011 is coming very, very close to that, if not equal to that. And that's in terms of area of ice, which you can easily measure by a satellite. More difficult to do because you need multiple satellites, but now it's been done over the last decade or so, is to look at the volume of ice. And every year the volume of ice is decreasing in the Arctic summer. So that's telling us that more and more of the ice is new, and it's going to lead to further decreases in the future in the amount of ice in the summer.
Now, there's a real human reality with climate change. What's happening to the Alaskan communities as a result of this ice disappearing?
Well, Simon mentioned one effect. Traditionally, many structures are built on the frozen ground. That's the foundation. And as it thaws and softens, these buildings sink. Also, the roads sink. And on the coastal, in the coastal areas, they get a double effect because the thawing takes place and the ice melts, so the sea ice melts, so the storms come in from the sea, and the storms are stronger, and the sea level rise also accentuates the lateral movement of these storm surges. Several communities, whole communities, have had to already be relocated. They have had to abandon their ancestors' homes and move somewhere else.
Now, Noah, let's kind of wrap up and go back to the top of the conversation here. I mean, is there any doubt that climate change is actually occurring in Alaska?
I don't think there's any doubt that that the high latitudes, particularly the Arctic, is warming. We know that again from direct temperature measurements. Eugene mentioned this polar amplification, where the warming is actually larger in the Arctic, including Alaska, than in say the lower latitudes, such as where we are now in New York. So there's really not, in terms of the reality of the observations, there's really not any question about that observed change that's occurred over the last century.
And I believe in some ways there's a positive message to this. There's some things that we can do. Would you like to share some of the things that people in Alaska and elsewhere can do to combat climate change?
Well, there's a lot of things, and we've been discussing some of those in this program. Of course, at the personal level, there's things that people can do, but the magnitude of the change that we're facing requires large systematic changes in our energy, in our food, and our water, and how we deal with those things. But as an educator myself, I'm very interested in trying to inspire and encourage young people, like our college students or even in the K-12 community, to get involved. And I'm part of a program called the Green Ninja Project, where we try to help teachers and get kids interested and inspired in solutions to climate change, which also helps promote their own education. And so I think ideas like this to get our young people to be aware that our climate is changing, but also aware that there are so many different types of solutions, is one great way for people to start to get involved.
In your area, you're at San Jose University. I mean, you're in the hub of clean tech, not just in California, America, but the world. It must be an exciting place to be.
Yeah, I mean, when I talk to our students about climate change, I have to admit sometimes it's a little bit depressing for them. But the second part of the course is always about solutions, and it's about clean tech, and it's about places like Google, who are working on in the solar industry, and it's about thin film panels, and there's a whole bunch of really interesting, compelling things going on. And that's when you see young people start to get it, that they get to redesign the future. They get to redevelop what are our cities going to look like, what are our homes going to be like, what are the new cars going to be like in the future. And that's exciting. And that's, I think, the kind of vision that we want to give our young students, because they are our future.
Absolutely. Simon, do you care to add anything to that?
You know, I have the same experience, I should say, with my own students, and I find that after talking about climate change, about the science, people get excited about all the things that we can do. And really, I mean, what it's about is my generation and the generation of the students that we're often talking to. You know, it's going to be up to us to find the solutions, you know, because some of the climate change at this point we can't avoid. Some changes we are committed to. But some of these really disastrous futures that you see discussed, those we can still avoid, but we've got to really mobilize and do it now.
Mr. Gore, is climate change an opportunity for Americans to innovate?
Very definitely. And going back to the conversation about Silicon Valley, not too many decades ago, the computer industry was seen as a very tiny business. The head of IBM once famously predicted there would be a worldwide demand for no more than, what, a dozen or 20 computers. And now it's driving stock markets around the world. The digital age is upon us. Now some are saying, oh, the renewable energy industry, like the photovoltaic business, is very small. But one of the slides that we saw earlier showed that the new installations in the U.S. alone doubled in 1 year. Last year, the price came down 30%. And the curve that shows this incredible increase in adoption and decrease in price very closely resembles what happened in the chip industry and the computer industry. It is beginning to really take off with the price decreases and the growing demand. And much more research and development money is going into the development of even better systems. For the last several years, the largest source of new electricity production in the U.S. was wind power. And globally, renewable energy is now adding more new electricity, as much new electricity generation as all of the other sources combined. So we are on the cusp of a real change, but we have to make it more quickly. And so winning the conversation is important. Making changes in our own use of energy and environmental choices. But most important of all is something mentioned earlier. It's important to change the light bulbs and the windows and the insulation. It's way more important to change the laws. So we have to get these systemic changes mentioned earlier. Put a price on carbon, reflect it in the routine economic choices that are made. Stop subsidizing coal and oil and start making this switch to low carbon energy sources much more quickly.
Wonderful. And very finally, we just got 30 seconds left. Any message to corporations who are looking to embrace sustainability, as a lot of them already are?
A lot of them are, yes. Some who don't care to get into the debate about climate science are discovering that it saves them money. And they're finding that their customers, a large number of their customers, want to patronize businesses that are part of the solution instead of being part of the problem. And of course, how many wars can we have in the Persian Gulf before we realize that the true cost of oil and carbon-based fuels is just prohibitive? How long can we borrow money from China to buy oil from a market dominated by Saudi Arabia and burn it in ways that destroy the future? All of that has to change. We can create tens of millions of jobs by accelerating this shift.
Absolutely. We have to leave it there. Thank you so much, panelists. And that was a very informative discussion. We'll see you back for more 24 Hours of Reality. Coming up, French Polynesia at its best and worst. Special guest Amber Valletta, plus a reality check with our panel of guests. All that and more on Hour 5 of 24 Hours of Reality.
Last year, Nashville, Tennessee experienced a once-in-a-thousand-year flood. It was unprecedented in the amount of area that was flooded. This happens to be a portable classroom. Portable classrooms are intended to be moved, but not like this. This happens to be June 2nd, 2011. And you notice that while they're having extreme droughts in parts of China, they're also having extreme moisture in other parts of China. And so you have both of these things running parallel, and that's in fact what we saw in the United States this year. I may say that the Canadians are losing their boreal forest. They're projecting that 8 of the next 10 years that their boreal forest will actually lose more carbon than they'll store, and so the Canadian boreal forest will become a carbon source and not a sink. And for someone who works for wildlife, seeing this image really reminds me how important it is that we address climate change, because wildlife are clearly in the bullseye of what's happening to our world.
If you believe in thermometers, then you have to believe in global warming. It's really not a matter of belief, it's a matter of observation.
If it's caused by the heat-trapping gases, then that's trapping them from the heat from going back out. So you would expect the lower atmosphere to warm up and the stratosphere to actually get cooler. Well, that's exactly what's happening. It's like CSI climate.
You've been watching presenters from around the world speak about the ways dramatic weather events are linked to global climate change. Act now. Speak up. Win the conversation. Choose reality. Join the Climate Reality Project and donate today by going to climaterealityproject.org. The climate crisis is happening right now, and it's happening fast. We need your help. "24 hours, 24 time zones." Join us now as we journey around the world to explore the realities of climate change.
The world is joining hands for 24 Hours of Reality, an event that focuses the world's attention on the full truth, scope, scale, and impact of the climate crisis. Today marks the beginning of a new era of action addressing the climate crisis. Together, we can focus the world's attention. This is 24 Hours of Reality.
I'm Sarah Backhouse, and I'd like to thank the 1.6 million of you who've joined us on 24 Hours of Reality. We've heard from 4 locations, but we have 20 more to go. That's why it's called 24 Hours of Reality. To us, reality isn't just a word in the title. It's a reality that temperatures are rising. It's a reality that our climate is changing. It's a reality that climate change is increasing the odds of extreme weather, such as heat waves, floods, and droughts. It's also a reality that climate change isn't a political problem. It's a human problem. But it's a problem we can all solve together. During the course of this broadcast, we'll continue to hear from the top climate scientists in the world, along with activists, business leaders, celebrity guests, and concerned citizens. And we'll continue to travel to diverse locations in every time zone. Most importantly, we'll remove the doubt about climate change once and for all. Please stay with us. Now let's head to our next location. Thanks to their stunning seascapes, white sandy beaches, and vibrant aquatic life, islands like Tahiti and Bora Bora are commonly associated with relaxing vacations and romantic honeymoons. But what you don't see in travel brochures is the increasing impact that extreme weather is having on this vulnerable territory. The Climate Reality team recently travelled to French Polynesia to capture the beauty of this region and expose the crisis that the agrarian and rural residents currently face. Take a look.
C'est la moitié des États-Unis, ça couvre Texas jusqu'en Californie. Et à l'intérieur de cet espace, il y a des îles volcaniques hautes et il y a des îles basses. Je m'appelle Jacques Briand, je suis ministre de l'Environnement, qu'on est en train de faire monter la mayonnaise. Même l'État est conscient, l'État français. Aujourd'hui, l'utilisation du milieu littoral, c'est principalement au niveau du pays. Pratiquement toute la route de Tahiti se trouve à moins de 50 mètres du bord de la mer.
Nous avons quand même certaines préoccupations par rapport à l'augmentation du niveau de la mer. Là, je m'appelle Hinano Murphy, je suis directrice associée de la station GUMP, la station de recherche de l'Université de Californie à Moorea. Et je suis également présidente de l'association Tepu Atitia. Alors, Tepu Atitia a une vocation de préserver, de promouvoir la culture polynésienne et qui a pour objectif de construire une plateforme d'échange entre les scientifiques et bien sûr la communauté locale. Dans le cadre des changements climatiques, nous avons beaucoup de projets qui sont mis en place sur la station. Les effets immédiats, on ne peut pas les percevoir actuellement parce que bon, on a bien sûr des effets El Niño qui sont liés aux effets El Niño comme le blanchiment des coraux, comme peut-être les décalages au niveau des saisons.
Je m'appelle Tekopunui Patrice, je représente l'association Yaura Terratura. Spécialement ici chez nous au Gambier, l'effet climatique c'est que nous avons actuellement l'effet saison, hiver et été. Beaucoup de propriétaires ont perdu leurs terres suite à la montée des eaux. Les eaux ont bouffé leurs terres.
Ce phénomène, la montée des eaux, tout le monde en Polynésie voit bien cette montée des eaux. Je m'appelle Monique Labé-Irichton. Je suis originaire des Gambiers. Ma maman, mon papa. En Polynésie, la mer, on voit ça. À chaque fois quand on va au bord de l'eau, les mètres de terre que la mer a grignoté. Et à la marée haute, on voit presque plus de plage. Et je pense souvent à mes voisins, les Tuamotu surtout, parce qu'ils ne sont pas beaucoup de hauteur au-dessus de l'eau.
Qui sont des atolls, ce sont des îles qui vivent pratiquement à hauteur de l'eau. Et dans quelques années, il faudra, ces îles vont disparaître et c'est quand même la moitié de notre patrimoine qui disparaît.
Mais tous ces espaces sont au bord de la mer. Donc il faut monter. Et pour nous monter, ce n'est pas nécessairement rester sur Tahiti, mais c'est aussi...
Et là, je pense qu'il faut faire très très vite parce que ça peut vite arriver, comme peut-être ça va traîner encore quelques années.
Je pense que c'est un truc mondial, il faut que ce serait international, que tout le monde s'y mette.
Alors j'appelle ces populations, toutes ces personnes qui ne croient pas, de pouvoir mieux se documenter peut-être, d'essayer de voir à côté et essayer chacun déjà à son niveau se dire qu'est-ce que je peux faire pour mes enfants plus tard.
As the General Director of the David Suzuki Foundation in Quebec, our next presenter provides science-based education, advocacy and policy recommendations. He's advised the United Nations on sustainability, met with Inuit leaders in the Arctic, and co-founded the Unisphera International Centre. In an effort to prove he's not just involved with the project for a free vacation, he's presenting to Mangareva, French Polynesia from New York today. Carl Meyrand, please welcome and step up to the podium to give your presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bonsoir, je me nomme Karel Meyrand, je viens de Montréal au Canada. Je suis directeur à la Fondation David Suzuki et président du projet de la réalité climatique Canada.
I come from Canada.
Je vous remercie d'être avec moi, de partager 7 heures des 24 heures de réalité.
Nothing.
Quelque part,
Oh my God.
quelque part dans l'univers, il existe
Nothing.
peut-être une autre Terre. Une autre Terre où la température ne se réchauffe pas. Une autre Terre où les tempêtes de pluie ne sont pas de plus en plus fortes. Où des inondations ne causent pas des ravages importants. Quelque part dans l'univers, il existe peut-être une autre Terre. Et sur cette Terre,
I can't hear it.
les sécheresses ne deviennent pas de plus en plus sévères, de plus en plus longues et ne tuent pas les récoltes, les animaux et les gens. Quelque part dans l'univers, une autre Terre existe où les incendies ne se propagent pas sauvagement et ne brûlent pas de plus en plus intensément et de plus en plus longtemps. Une Terre où les vents et les tempêtes ne sont pas de plus en plus destructeurs. Peut-être quelque part, mais pas ici, parce qu'ici, nous vivons dans le monde de la réalité. Revenons ensemble sur les événements qui se sont produits au cours de la dernière année. En août de la dernière année, en 2010, au Pakistan, on a vu des inondations historiques qui ont recouvert presque la totalité du pays. Ces inondations ont affecté 20 millions de personnes qui ont été déstabilisées et ça a contribué à déstabiliser un pays qui possède l'arme nucléaire. Au début de cette année, en Australie, des inondations historiques, encore une fois, ont eu lieu et ont couvert une région très, très importante du pays qui équivaut à la superficie de la France et de l'Allemagne réunies. On voit ici une région, un quartier avant et après l'inondation. En Corée du Sud, toujours cette année, en 2011, il y a quelques mois à peine, en juillet, cet homme lave ses vitres après avoir été inondé au 4e étage d'un bâtiment. On voit ici les ravages causés en Corée du Sud. La province d'Hunan, en Chine, a subi des pluies torrentielles qui ont inondé 13 provinces et affecté 8,5 millions de personnes en juin de cette année. En Colombie, cette année, des inondations importantes ont touché tout le pays. Et au cours de la dernière année seulement, la Colombie a reçu en une seule année 5 fois sa moyenne historique de pluie.
Reached its highest average of rain in the last 5 years. The result is that 2 million people were evacuated. In the U.S., the Mississippi River has flooded this year, and we can see here a levee that broke. And near my house in Quebec, after a very important snowstorm, there were some important precipitations and a flood that affected millions of people. Then let's go to Tennessee, here where we see a hotel that was flooded, and the rain, the torrential rain that happened usually only once every 1,000 years happened twice. And let's go to Asia, where a typhoon where this was the typhoon, the strongest to have ever reached land. This typhoon left 1.14 meters of rain on the ground in one day. This same typhoon had impacts in other parts of the area. Here is a picture that was taken in Thailand at the same time. Let's now go to South America. The rains in Brazil that caused some landslides and thousands of people that were buried and their residents as well. And indeed, the events that happened in Brazil made people say, and the president say, that Brazil is feeling the climate changes that are happening all over the world when there are droughts, severe drought. Why is there more and more heavy rain and floods? In fact, the warming of the planet is contributing to these incidents because it is modifying the environment in which all the storms take place. And so it is the human activity that is having an impact on the whole world. The company Munich Re, that is the strongest company that is helping in the it's adding as well that the phenomenon are extreme and intense because of the warming of the planet that is happening, and this is from some research made by the government. This is not a theory or just a hypothesis or the results of computer models. We observe climate changes. It is a real fact that is really happening, and it is a scientific fact. This is from Richard Somerville at the University of Chicago. In other words, the big storms are becoming bigger and bigger and stronger and more frequent. We asked the question to James Hansen, the big scientist, is the global warming, was it at the origin of the reason for the Moscow 2010 canicule and the rains in Pakistan? So if you change the question and you ask, would these events have taken place if the carbon dioxide levels had stayed at their previous level of 280 ppm before the Industrial Revolution? And the answer is certainly not. So here's now the link between the climate crisis and the increase in extreme weather storms. In 2,000 years, the carbon dioxide and the world temperature, you can see on the left in blue the rain, and in red on the right the temperatures. And you can see here clearly that within the last few years, the curve is increasing very promptly. When the temperatures increase, the oceans evaporate, more humidity in the sky, and this is a very important factor. You can see here the temperature, the increase in the yearly temperatures that is very strong. And you can see now the increase in the precipitations. In the last 10 years, you can see a very strong increase. To understand well the link, you can understand the cycle of water. So there is evaporation and then precipitation, and then it comes back into the rivers and the sea. So this is something that we've all learned